Together, we must turn ideas into action. Together, we must stay ahead of the threat. Today, we shape the next decade of cyber defence.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm interested in securing our technology stack. The problem is we don't really have a nice orderly stack of technology. It's more of a tangle. Systems comprise a hugely diverse range of hardware, software, configurations, all assembled and involved at different times by different parts of the supply chain. So good security is really hard to buy. Resilience should be designed in. It's good engineering, diligent product management practices, comprehensive support and testing, both during development and throughout the life cycle. These qualities are really hard to verify if you're a potential customer trying to compare product offerings or even trying to make sense of what's already on your network. So that can mean the incentive for investor to invest in such things can be limited, as the returns can be really hard to realize. So good security is also really hard to sell. So radical transparency is about exposing more detail to those customers and operators so we can give credit for the often unsung security effort where it's due. So I'm delighted to be joined by our panel today to dig into this a bit more. I'm going to let them introduce themselves very shortly, but between them they have a wealth of experience of cybersecurity from an industry and government perspective, spanning technical security research, product development, and the impact of government policy interventions on market incentives. So we're going to focus on two types of transparency. The first is transparent products. So that's more insight into the status of a product in operation. So how many do I have on my system right now? Is that one there up to date? Is it still supported? And then move on to transparent vendors. We want more insight into the process of developing and supporting a product. It needs to be okay to talk about the process of finding vulnerabilities, fixing them in the short term, and then using those experiences to address root causes in the longer term. So here at NCSC, we've started to embrace this approach. So of course, we could go much further. We'll dig into that shortly. We're creating a national ecosystem of cyber resilience test facilities that use NCSC's principle-based assurance model to deliver transparent assurance at scale. The model draws from the claims, arguments, and evidence approach used by the safety community. Vendors demonstrate and document how well their product or service satisfies security principles. The test facility publishes a report based on their assessment of those claims, the arguments, and the evidence, and that will be made available to potential customers. So that's the transparency bit. So for vendors, that allows market differentiation. For customers, it's significantly more information than a pass-fail type certification. On the product side, I'm sure some of you will have spotted my colleague Sam's excellent lightning talk on visible version numbers. She makes a compelling case for products to share their update status on the wire, even though that information will also be available to potential attackers. So that's radical. So on to our panel. Let's kick off with some introductions. First.
Hi, yes. I am Glenn Thorpe. I work for Grey Noise Intelligence. I lead the research team there currently. Briefly, I've been in the field for well over 20 years, working from practitioner positions to leadership positions. There was a mention yesterday of kind of zigzag careers, and I feel like that's kind of been mine, which has been wonderful. Between vendors, working for a vendor, government, industry partner, and private industry, and then intelligence community. So. And now, kind of, as all of us are, pivoting to more AI intelligence.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ross McKercher. I'm the CISO at Sophos. My responsibilities across both product and corporate, but I really spend probably 8% of my time on product security. That's what our customers really care about for obvious reasons, and I really want to try and make Sophos a highly trustworthy vendor, and that starts with having secure by design and strong products.
Hi there, so Carla Baker, Head of Strategy and Cyber Policy. So I've been working in cyber policy for over 15 years, so I've seen the evolution of the government's approach to both cyber policy, its approach to strategy, and how it's kind of worked with industry to kind of demonstrate conformance, look at developing strategies and approaches that build resilience.
Cool, thanks panel. So I'll start with Glenn with a quick question. What are you seeing in terms of exploitation trends currently, and what are the problems we need to solve?
Yeah, so I think about this, well, the bottom line up front is, and this is not going to be like shocking news, but exploitation is scaling faster than defenses are currently. And I kind of think about this framing in three different sectors. The first is the scale that these are happening. So it's not news that attackers are focused on the edge. We've been hearing that for a while now, since COVID essentially, and that continues to be true. But I think what is maybe news to a lot of people is just the concentration which that is still happening, though. It is still a very major focus for attackers. That's supported by several different publications. The Verizon DBR talks about it. Last year, there was an 8x increase in edge exploitation. Mandiant talked about the top 4 vulns last year were edge device vulns. Census tracked edge devices for 6 months post the Salt Typhoon campaign and found that exposures only went down 25%, which is shocking for such a large campaign. But Cisco iOS device exposure went up. And then, all of this data is essentially like supported by what we observe firsthand at Gray Noise. Is the edge is just still the primary, the go-to target for attackers. The second part of this kind of three-legged stool that I think about what is being observed right now is the speed at which this is happening. Again, DBAR talking about the average exploitation of these edge vulnerabilities is 0 days, but the average time to patch them is over 30 days. That's absolutely frightening, especially as this, the last few days and months, but especially if you've been hearing about the deluge of vulnerabilities being found by AI and stuff like that. So that patch diffing is still a really large issue, and it's not actually a new issue for the industry. And to make that worse, half of the IPs that we see at Gray Noise that are throwing RCE attempts are actually from IPs that have no history. They're not on a block list. They just show up and they're going at it. Like their first thing that's observed is exploitation. So that makes it obviously pretty hard to defend against. And then the last thing that I'll frame it as is there's a really I think it's getting worse, but there's an information gap that is kind of a pattern that's existing across our field. And due to many different reasons, I think it's, like I said, it's getting worse. But a quick example, which I'm US, so work with CISA, but CISA has like a KEV, the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, and in that is a field that's like known ransomware usage campaign. And that field, I came across this by accident, and then that made me go look into it. But it turns out that field gets updated silently, and it happened 59 times last year. So that's something that changes the threat characterization pretty greatly, but it happens in silence without the same fanfare or alert or feed or whatever that the initial addition to the catalog happens. So that's just creating a gap that's just making it harder for defenders in general.
So we need to improve the information available to defenders. So Ross, how can products be more transparent during operation?
Yeah, look, I think it helps to take the counterfactual. Like, why would you not be transparent when you answer this question? And ultimately, it kind of boils down to just a security through obscurity debate. And look, I'm a pragmatist on this, by the way. Like, in theory, security by obscurity doesn't work, but I think we all know that in practice, sometimes it can be helpful. So I think about security. I think about this in terms of strategic versus tactical. So tactically, it might make sense to not always be super transparent. If you're like, we can maybe get to, if we have time, some specific examples of campaigns where we've made that tactical decision when we're defending our products. But strategically, I would say I'm close to an absolutist. Like I think we should be exceptionally transparent. So certainly version numbers on the right, yeah, great example. We've got to remember that everything that hampers an attacker also hampers an administrator who's actually managing the product. You can't differentiate those two things. So whether it's version numbers, SBOMs, like deep introspection tools, all that kind of stuff, I think is what we should get to. But it's not like you can do it overnight. It's definitely, we'll get into the policy side in a little bit, it's definitely a journey. You've got to take it one step at a time. If one vendor does this and gets too far ahead of the rest of the community, then that generates a bunch of problems for that vendor. So there's almost perverse incentives to doing it as well. And I'll just finish by saying AI, we didn't take as long.
Yeah.
The mean time to AI of about 30 seconds, I think we had there. So AI also shifts that balance of like obscurity really doesn't work very well. So yeah, I'm probably about as extreme as you'll get. Full-on transparency should be the goal for everyone. I mean, maybe not your private keys, but as close to those as you can get. Outrun the attackers. So bug bounties, things like that. Actually, transparency is really useful for bug bounty researchers. The trick is patch the issues before the bad guys find them. Make it really easy for you to do that. It's just about the blocking and tackling on the journey that is a really interesting conversation, I think.
So there's a danger of we all know where we want to go, but maybe not today. And so how do we work, just moving on to Carlo, with the procurement community and the policy community to encourage people to get out of that tactical mindset and into the strategic one?
So not to simplify, but I think from a technical perspective, I think it can be not more easier, but it's the wrong way of saying it, but I think it can be quite challenging from a policy and regulatory perspective because there are just so many different types of schemes, frameworks, initiatives out there. So I think first off, you've got to be clear about, what are we being transparent with and about. So for example, in the UK alone, there are different guidance frameworks, things like, Cyber Essentials, and then you've got the DCC in defence, and then you've got, if you work in the telecom sector, there's a telecom vendor system. So there are already these kind of self-attestations and third-party assessments that you already have to do. So we've got to be mindful not to kind of overload industry in terms of, another set of requirements or being clear or being specific about what you're requiring industry to. But it can be a really useful tool because effectively what you're doing is providing, evidence of your security approaches and providing that trust and transparency to your community base, which is really important. But I think, but then back to the point around procurement can play a really central role here because if you look back to what I said at the start, it's like I've seen the journey of where governments come from in the last, say, 15 years. We've come from publish some guidance, please, can you follow, through to where we are now with the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. We've got a big stick. In between there is what are the other incentives and market incentives that we can drive behaviours, and procurement is one of them. We can sort of embed specific requirements in the procurement process to effectively mandate the adherence to a specific approach. But it's about being clear about, back to my start, it's like, what are you asking for? So there's a lot of different levers that you can use.
So there are specific approaches, maybe this is for anyone, that we could be embedding into these things. What should we be asking for, and how do we get to consensus?
Yeah.
I'll take, maybe picking up on your point, Carlo, a bit. Secure by demand is definitely a really, really big portion of this, and there's no point in me publishing an SBOM that has huge, huge levels of detail if a procurement team boils that down to, well, that SBOM has got shows a library in it that is vulnerable. It just creates friction. There's a lot of education about what we have to do with these transparent materials and a lot of a shared understanding before any of this becomes actionable. And it can drive really the wrong behaviors because if we just went ahead with that, the behavior becomes update all your libraries all the time as quickly as possible. And we've seen with some of the NPM attacks in the last few weeks, that also introduces its own set of risks because you don't want, you want to be version pinning when you're building products, and often the vulnerabilities that an SBOM show will not necessarily be reachable. So there's all these complexities, and procurement teams can be very simplistic in the way that they look at vendor requirements.
But I think, with SBOMs, there's a slight risk of you don't get the contextualized information. SBOM is just a list. It's a shopping list, effectively, of what's included in your bag. And I don't know, does that get the outcome that you really are striving for? And then you've got to think about it from a user perspective, a customer perspective. How many would they receive? You're one vendor, I'm one vendor. They'll be getting multiple different SBOM lists from companies, and then will there not be SBOM fatigue, just too much overload, and then how does that get the outcome that you want to achieve in the first place?
My counter to that, I mean, I agree with you, but my counter to that would be, if we all did it all the time everywhere, then there'd be a bunch of tools that would emerge, a bunch of approaches, like the ecosystem would follow the data because we'd all realize there's some useful signal in this noise, but there needs to be a whole set of like security teams need to build up a skill set to be able to, at scale, understand what a vendor's SBOM really means and what they take. Yeah. But someone's got to start. I don't think you can mandate the ecosystem without the data being available, because what you really want to do is unleash people's creativity and lead with the data would be my argument.
I would even question, are we kind of putting value behind the right things when we're talking about digging into not just the SBOM, but for example, if someone's evaluating two products and they're just looking at the CVEs, one has a bunch, one has very few, that kind of creates a negative, a punishment for transparency.
Yeah, that's the worst thing to look at.
And so you need to don't look at it because if they have a bunch, maybe that's just a mature disclosure program. If they have few, maybe that just means that they're hiding something. That's not the bar, but a lot of orgs will still look at that.
Totally.
But there's other ways of, what do they do? Root cause analysis? Do they share that? What is the median patch time? Basically it's all about the response. We have to move into a more real, it's funny we say this after so many decades, but move into a more realistic viewpoint of not what, but how. How do you respond? How does someone handle these things? Because that's what matters.
Yeah, we're definitely moving into the sort of vendor transparency thing, which is fine, but how do we, I got this plan, but,
That's never going to work.
There's no plan.
That's whatever. But how do we encourage that behavior in terms of, as you mentioned, if you're the one vendor if one vendor reaches out with an account of vulnerability, that can be tricky. Whereas if there's a consensus that this is the right thing to do, it can be more of a discussion and more of a debate.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is kind of a market failure because you have a first mover disadvantage. So there is an opportunity for regulation to help here, mandates. It's just ensuring that they don't get boiled down and simplified into some really, again, perverse incentives all the way down. So I'd defer to maybe the policy person.
Yeah. I would say the regulation, or I think that's the last resort. I think that's the previous panel session. Is the German official mentioned that regulation is a tool in the box, but it's got to be the last resort. There's other mechanisms that you can use. So, for example, if you haven't seen it, the DCIT have published the Software Security Code of Practice. So that's kind of, I would say, if you look at the incentives as an axis, you kind of got soft guidance and you've got regulation over here. I kind of put it in the middle, that it's kind of, it's a self-attestation, I can never say that word, self-attestation of your security approach. And it's aligned to 4 overarching principles, and at the moment, DCIT have launched an ambassador scheme. So we're part of the scheme. I know it's not, and that's about you're demonstrating the transparency, you're demonstrating the approaches you take to secure software development, and then you're being public about it, and then you're championing the scheme. And I think that can be that kind of first mover type initiative. So it's hopefully we're part of the scheme. Hopefully other vendors will follow, and it kind of helps kind of drive the maturity of the scheme and uptake of the code.
I mean, Paul, we've had this debate quite a lot. Like as vendors, NCSC has a ton of soft power. So the carrot of just a little, tap on the head, a little bit of congratulations for doing the right thing. There's definitely a good opportunity there that we could probably unleash. It has to be a very holistic approach, doesn't it? You can't. Yeah. It's not just one thing.
Okay, so I mean, what are the blockers to vendors being more transparent? Is there a culture of those kind of things? Because going back to the product thing, at one point, an information disclosure was regarded as a vulnerability. And do you think that legacy hinders the incentive to be transparent?
I mean, that's like a 1990s artifact from, things that we are talking about wanting now, which is the version numbers being more transparent, would or could still get you a CVE assigned. So I think there's cultural and technical. So that's an example of the cultural barriers that we just talked about. But There's also some technical issues or barriers where at least focusing on edge devices, which is kind of what I've spent most of my time on, those are often like just black boxes that, run specialized or tuned software, so there's not a lot of controls like your typical endpoints that you could add to. So that's kind of a strong technical barrier for being able to stand up some of that transparency and help defenders like get fully understand, and even like on down the chain of like what's in a SBOM, what do we what or how are we affected by this SBOM, et cetera.
I mean, I'll give you a very specific example. It's actually quite interesting that you've picked two firewall vendors.
Yeah, I know, right?
I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but it worked very well because
that's why I'm all the way over here.
Because we all have a lot of experience of defending against edge device exploitation here. I mean, so coming back to my tactical piece, we had some pretty reliable intel that our attackers were some adversaries. It's our Pacific Rim report. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. You can go and Google it. We collaborate quite closely with both actually Palo and Grey Nose on that. So yeah, we had some very good intel that they were on how the attackers were fingerprinting our devices, things like hashing the fav icon, stuff like that. Very kind of standard processes. And in the moment, like when we know there is kind of like that when our adversaries are attempting kind of mass exploitation and they are, frankly on the front foot, and we know that they've probably got more O-Day and that this is just one wave of many, we made some very tactical decisions to reduce discoverability of our devices because we had some very practical threat intel that we'd actually managed to get from like a C2 server from some law enforcement collaboration. We saw their tooling, we saw their discovery tooling essentially, and we knew that was how they're fingerprinting our devices. So why would we not make it hard, and I'm talking like days, weeks, and maybe months here, why would we not make it hard for them to use to not be able to fingerprint our devices in that way? That's a tactical decision that we made in the very, very short term to disrupt a campaign. Doesn't mean that we don't want to be able to make our devices more discoverable in the long term, if you follow me.
Was that like a permanent decision where it was like
no,
or
it
was
was
it for
like
a certain period of time?
It was like right now, let's disrupt this campaign because it's causing significant harm.
And was
across,
there a noticeable outcome from that decision?
I honestly don't know if we managed to like it was a messy situation.
Yeah.
I don't know, but when we're seeing we are seeing customer harm in real time, we are essentially throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this problem, and we certainly know that like the general kind of ragbag of things that we did that were extremely short term and very hacky. I have high confidence that I don't know exactly which ones had what effect. It was very hard to prove out causality there, but we disrupted some very significant campaigns, and I feel like we probably saved tens of thousands of customers from being compromised in some of these campaigns. And if that meant that we were kind of deviating from a long-term strategy to do it, like I'll stand behind that at any time, basically.
I mean, do you have to open up again afterwards to sort of get back on the strategic path, and how do we?
Yeah. We just reverted a bunch of the changes to try and kind of align to. Like
that sort of leads on to how much is too much, right? I mean, we talked at the beginning that sharing private keys is generally not recommended, but also we're in there's quite rightly a competitive marketplace, and some of these things need to be kept back. But is there a particular way of drawing a boundary around what should be shared and what should not be in the long term?
I've certainly not thought about it well enough to have like a super strong opinion. I just come back to you've got to merge the long-term aims, the customer demand with the threat intel. It really is a kind of like a CISO role, if you know what I mean, to be able to like have that short-term and long-term picture. And I would just decide it on a kind of case by case.
Should we be asking for open sourcing of your whole code base?
Well, I think the value of source code alone has dropped. Anyone can produce source code now. You could argue, there's some types of source code that models can't create. The value for Sophos and our source code is the way that it's combined with our services and our threat and our threat intelligence. So I think the calculus of what source code, not to mention that we all have products that are much more just open source They're just all open source stacks now, right? Especially like SaaS, SaaS software firewalls. There's a ton of open source in that, and actually you can fingerprint a SaaS tool pretty easily. You can figure out their tech stack, and you can figure out all the libraries. So we're actually pretty close to open source anyway in a lot of this stuff. So I would be, if you'd asked me a few years ago, I'd have been like, you're absolutely insane. But if you ask me now, I'm closer to the maybe we should be sharing, especially under escrow agreements and stuff. Maybe we should be sharing more of our source code, especially if that means that we can get the right AI agents, hunting through them, again, staying ahead of the attackers. Then I will try and outrun the attackers any day of the week. And if that involves sharing source code, so be it.
So I think it depends on the context. So we've talked about it from different perspectives in terms of the product and vendor. So if you look at it from the software security vendor approach, I think it depends. Like you've got to find a balance. Like as we've said, if you share too much, then it just creates noise. And it's meaningless, and how can a user or customer kind of internalize it, and how is that useful for an organization? But also, you've got on the other side, you've got to be careful of the organization itself. Like you can't share too much. If you share too much of your secret source, then obviously there's a security risk there. So it's about finding the balance of how much is too much, but how much is enough to provide that kind of verifiable evidence and the transparency and how does it garner the trust with your customer base. So it's that balance is what we need to strive for.
I would argue that, again, just based on what we observed, that obviously what we're doing now isn't working, and so or working well enough. And right now, what we're doing now is not sharing a lot of that information, or making it easy for the defenders. So like we observed, brute force campaign or VPN campaign, whatever, like over and over again, where they, they're not doing version checks. The attackers, when I say they're not doing version checks before they start trying to exploit or log in or whatever, whatever they're up to. They just go straight to work. And so I kind of view it as almost like, are we asking the right question? Because the defenders are probably the ones that can take the most action from exposing this version information, whereas attackers don't care. They don't need it. They just do the thing because it's so cheap to just do broadly. Unless they, as you get more advanced, then that changes, of course, as the attacker gets more advanced. But, for a broad swath of what we observe, it's just, they just get to work. So I think it would benefit the defenders a lot more than the offensive side if we did that.
So there does seem to be a consensus for sharing more information around things like version numbers, support lifetimes, that kind of thing. Just to put in
I think Carlos' point's very valid, though. There's all this stuff to do it safely generates quite a lot of work in an organization. We have to be conscious of excuse me. Have to be conscious of the risks of more vulnerabilities being discovered on source code, et cetera, et cetera. It's you've got to be. There's no point getting too far ahead of what the market can digest. There's I'm really a big advocate. I actually think the way that we think about and procure software and services, there needs to be a massive radical change in thinking. And this is probably, hopefully, anyone who buys software and services, which is probably everyone in this room, really need to think about this. Like, think really carefully about what your procurement processes are actually asking, because they are historically not driving the right incentives. There is, I would love customers to be asking much more pointed questions around the mechanisms by which I demonstrate transparency, whether it's bug bounty programs, whether I can whether I can provide SBOMs, the fact that we're a CNA, which means that we can do CVEs and et cetera, et cetera. These are really good indicators of maturity, in my opinion, which matter way more to customers than getting a questionnaire about whether I have MFA enabled. Yes, no. That's my corporate estate. Of course, I need to keep the corporate estate secure, sure, whatever. But the thing that you're buying, the thing that you're putting in your network, that's the thing that you absolutely care about being secure. And there's just a massive disconnect between what the procurement questionnaires that I see and the focus on that. And I would love a way and maybe this is back to the kind of policy side, I would love a way of moving that debate on so that I get the questions that make me squirm a little bit, sure, but then I go to my product managers and say, customers are asking for this.
Yeah.
And then I can get the internal alignment to do the right thing.
So I think that goes down to kind of your point about the blockers. So if there aren't standardized approaches to these things, that what are procurement teams, what should they be asking for? If government could help support kind of the standardized, these are the things that procurement teams should be asking about if it's this or that bucket. Because if there isn't that standardization, then your procurement teams aren't going to know what to ask for. And then once that kind of demand is there, then that is kind of then in turn an incentive for organisations to do more, or step up, or share more, all that kind of stuff, because it's there, and that's their kind of incentive.
Yep, radical evolution of procurement processes. Maybe the,
Sounds sexy.
And then I guess you get to the how should we go about that? Because one thing we could do is come up with some UK-specific procurement standards, and we're in a global marketplace, right? So we could have the argument that it doesn't help if each country comes up with its own standards. So how do we go about developing that kind of consensus?
Clear, not saying standards, standardised. So I don't want an
less.
additional standard. But I think that's a good point in that it's already quite a crowded landscape. So we've talked about some of the stuff, but that's just UK specific. And that's also one of the blockers is you've got to be mindful of that we're lots of international organisations that have to adhere to things. You know, we've got stuff in the UK, but then in Europe you've got the CRA, so the Cyber Resilience Act, you've got DOR, you've got all these different requirements, and then you've got the software pledge in the US. There are different initiatives. So I think it's about, to make it easier, it would be great to do some sort of mapping, how does it all fit together, and that's where that kind of standardised approach could fit in, not standardised.
I'll put in a quick plug for standards, just because there's something about standardizing the principles that we try to follow, so that the legislation and regulations that come out of it have a kind of common base. Once again, good in theory. How well it works in practice is always interesting.
International ones, though, preferably.
Well, quite, absolutely, yes. Were you going to say something?
I was, but what was it?
Sorry.
No, it's all right. It was hearing you talk about, like, you know, we all want to move in this direction, but then we have to be careful of if we move in that direction, are we moving away from a different direction that we've already set? So, like, all of these standards or standardizations eventually are probably meeting with some, you know, they're overlapping each other, or they're conflicting each other. So, you know, that's a world I absolutely don't know much about. But, you know, I'd be curious, like, from your standpoint, like, is there a need or would it move the security posture of many organizations if we had like less standards, less like matrices to align with, but they were all like more towards a general direction?
Yeah, so I think if you look at, so for example, how the CAF sits with NIST, or how CRA sits with initiatives, if there was that kind of mapping to understand where things fit, or if you're asking this question in this UK specific initiative, this means this in the CRA. Do you get what I mean? So it translates. It's that translation service. Yeah. So then you know that, if you've done the CRA, you can look back at the UK version and so it does this and this and this, and then I only have to do this bit. So I think the translation service, or standardized, or however you want to look at it, would be really useful.
Sorry, I would say, I mean, obviously, you know, multiple international bodies are operating in complete lockstep, amazing, right? But
all we have to do is agree on everything.
Yeah, exactly. I do think there's always more you can do around that. But I actually do think there's some places where NCSC can actually be a bit more agile, a bit more pragmatic, and actually move ahead. I'll give you an example that's slightly unrelated, but it was something that I still really like the NCSC for, and that is, it wasn't a standard, but you came out really strongly with some really practical advice around how, like, password expiries. It's quite a few years ago now. You know, password expiries are dumb for these reasons. You know, don't have complex passwords, all this stuff. Now, at the time that you did that, there was a bunch of regulation and compliance requirements that made you rotate your passwords, you know, every 5 minutes with, like, you know, 700 characters, you know, passwords or whatever they were. We adopted your advice because it aligned perfectly with our philosophy, really aggressively, and we kind of just used the number of times I just pinged your website to auditors just to kind of sow a little bit of FUD, but like positive FUD, if you see what I mean. And it actually worked. Like the auditors would go, you could kind of see the does not compute going on. And I never had to roll back that policy though. Like we always figured out a way through, because the compliance requirements, they're always quite, you can have a risk conversation, and you can usually get around most of the insanity. So I think there's opportunities for NCSC to just come out and say stuff like these are good practices.
There's a comment of compliance-based culture, right?
It's top cover for everyone else, basically.
Top cover,
We can point like they did it.
Yeah. So more top cover for like kind of almost not like dragging the conversation along. Yeah. It could be really helpful.
But sort of more in the concepts and principles rather than the detail of the requirements.
Yeah, just a really strong, crisp statement on a website that says this is why version numbers should no longer be considered a vulnerability. Yeah. Just something that I could just very quickly use as defensible material if I'm kind of on the back foot in a conversation.
And would you go further and say that sharing those version numbers on the wire, literally on the internet side of an edge device, is a sensible thing to do?
I think.
Put you on the spot.
I think that's fine. I think it comes back to discoverability for like kind of sysadmins versus anything that hampers an attacker also hampers a defender. Now, I'm going to sit on the fence. Long-term goal, yes. I think it matters specifically around the TTPs of what is going on at the moment as to when you make these decisions.
So then I guess the question is, how do we get off the fence? Because there's a danger.
Well, I mean, even so, sharing the version numbers only makes it easier, faster. It's still possible, usually, to figure out versions.
Right.
With
AI,
some effort.
AI means like tips the balance towards just doing, because it'll get there eventually.
Yeah, it's almost like not a white flag, but it's it's like, what's the point in resisting or whatever? Like, because we can move on and do something that's going to make a difference with the product. So,
But I would say this is assuming that you have to have a certain level of maturity in your products before you can embrace some of these some of the more extreme examples, like sharing an SBOM where there are genuinely just like, if you do make discoverability really, it's back to the security through obscurity has value if you're really on the back foot, in the very short term. So I would be nervous if I had to take a counter example. I would be very nervous if I had an extremely vulnerable product that had really old versions to just stick my SBOM on the website. That is information that is useful to an attacker.
But is that a driver though to not have that old software?
Of course it is. Yeah, no, of course it is.
Okay.
But it's an executional.
Okay.
This is a level where we need to,
Not
the regulation needs to be trailed. Maybe not like we're going to implement this immediately, but in the next N years, this is
like
going to be the requirement.
If you put CISOs in jail for putting SBOMs, if they didn't put their SBOMs in the internet in 6 months, like an extreme version of regulation, that would not be a good outcome for the country.
I'll write that down.
I think we could.
Call it the Ross.
Arguably, it might be in a year, but you'd get a lot of pain. There'd be a lot of short-term pain to get there.
So I guess sort of starting to summarize this up, there does seem to be a lot of appetite for doing some of these things, but how do we move, trying to pick the simple principles that we can put on the website and start to drive change? We've talked a bit about visible version numbers. I wonder if there's anything else I can get you to talk about. We're getting towards the end of our time, but what are the things we should be looking or could be looking to change over the next few years as kind of strategic incentives to encourage more transparency?
One thing that I'll say, because I mean we're all enterprise vendors here, so this has been very enterprise focused, but the landscape has changed, and there's a lot of residential proxies being used for attacks and stuff like that, where basically attackers are routing through people's home or SOHO devices to then go to their final target. So, we're talking about lifecycle transparency earlier, and this continues down to the SOHO or consumer devices as well, where I would like to see a world where you walk into the electronics store and you're looking for a home router or something, or your grandma's, whatever example you want to use, and like on it as a Best Buy date or whatever, right? Like the support for this product ends in 6 months or something. Like all these people may see is that this product is on sale, and they're like, oh, it's on sale. I'm going to take it and put it in my grandma's house. Well, it's on sale because it's been end of life, or it's about to be end of life. So like that's a small example that would have a huge impact.
We actually do have legislation for that effect in the UK. The PS
Oh, there you go. That's
requires
you're ahead.
a
That's
product
you're always
lifetime.
ahead.
I'm not convinced there's always a great big shiny label on a device with the best before.
Just
but, there is an idea about transparency
I love it.
of support lifetimes. And
We'll start with that, and
I'll
let's
come
take
back
it
on
elsewhere.
you that though. But how many people would understand that? So if you think about the usual, the average, not people that's obviously CyberUK, but the average user, the average person in the street, will they understand
There's
what that means?
expiration
So
date.
it's like back to the IoT legislation that you're referencing. Do they understand the terms there if you put it on a badge and you put it on a product?
Sadly, it has to stop working when the expiration date goes off, and that's
Fair.
a very
Yeah, there has-
controversial opinion. But that's where you need to get to, because you're right. I don't think people will, it's like yogurt, Like, has anyone listened to the expiration date on yogurt? This thing's good for
No, but we
right?
trust it. I don't know what happens after that, but just tell. Soho devices are made from dairy, and then people will respect the dates.
yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
is there anything else we could be asking for, just while we've got you on the spot?
I mean, in terms of specifics, because we're quite biased towards like edge devices. We should be, because there's a lot of pain there in this conversation. But the other big kind of emerging threat vector, I guess you call it, is obviously identity across cloud services, things like that. I don't know. This is again, we're not asking the right questions. We're looking at someone's external how many TLS certs are expired on the domain, because that's easy to external attack surface management, third-party risk management tools can show those things that really have very little correlation with a vendor's, maybe a slight hygiene correlation, but no more than that with a vendor's true security posture. What really matters in this new world is transparency into things like OAuth scopes. Like how much access does that app that you're going to be installing in your Entra ID tenant or your Google tenant, how much access does it require to do its job? How are they storing? How is this vendor storing the keys? And in my experience, asking those questions, you get crickets, and you end up having to go all the way back to the dev team to be able to figure, before anyone even understands. And maybe that's because we're asking those questions early. But like SaaS apps are, even at least if you're a really motivated buyer, and I'm sure you have lots of motivated buyers, you can kind of rip apart a firewall and figuring it out. But SaaS apps, like you can, it is hard to understand how what permissions they require, how they plug in. Nobody understands OAuth, right? Like almost nobody. So anything that we can do to light up that kind of area as well, because if you take the SalesLoft breach recently, I think there's another an AI vendor that's just had a pretty nasty incident. They're all like crazy OAuth scope problems that are happening, and I don't think we've focused much on that side of the conversation.
So I think, what else? I just think you've got to be clear about what you're asking for. So we've mixed this conversation from talking about like product security, your version number, the technical bit, through to calling it more the kind of policy geeky stuff around organizational approaches, your secure software by design type stuff. So just being clear around what transparency of what are you asking for, because I think generally a theme for this year's conference, I just think I'm hearing over and over again is like, organizations have just got to do more. So back to like the minister's speech yesterday when he was looking at the FTSE 350 letter to CEOs about, must do your governance code, do your cyber essentials. It's just a theme of doing more. So I just think, being specific in the next round of whatever policy interventions the government's going to be developing, be specific about what are you looking at product vulnerability and technical transparency, or more kind of at an organizational level.
Yeah, and certainly, we have a lot of mid-market and small market customers, and I totally acknowledge that I'm talking about like, OAuth scopes and S-bombs here, and like 3/4 of our customer base couldn't even spell or have any idea what I'm talking about. So expecting them to be able to interpret that, and that's again where and I know this is super hard, but really what those customers want, they do just want the green tick on the box, you know, on the box. It's about aligning, you know, like I'm not sure, I can't believe I'm actually asking for cyber essentials for products, but but something that something that boils this down into like very, and it's super hard, but boiling it down into really simple requirements so that the mid-market, small customers can understand it. We've got to get there, but in a way that you are agile enough that it just moves so quick. So, you know, what's right one year is a perverse incentive the next year, but then you move so quick and then the vendors hate you because you're changing it all the time.
Intention matters more than the actual, like, binary answer. Like, what is the intention of what the actions are trying to be?
Yeah, and things like, and it's hard to encodify this in a requirement, but things that demonstrate the right behaviors don't change as quickly as the specific technical things you're doing. So, you know, the bug bounty programs, the embracing responsible disclosure, the being transparent, you know, if you can't reward the specifics of the product because this stuff changes so quickly, at least figure out how to reward the vendor for having the right processes in place would be my argument.
And maybe there's something about talking about credit where it's due rather than everyone does more, because we have examples of the right things in different parts of our industry, and it's about trying to understand where those are and shine a light on them as much as it is about saying everyone has to do more, different, better.
That's the soft power thing, like coming out and just publicly not favoring vendors. I know that's dangerous for you, but but
I think there's something there, but we're not favoring vendors. But I think there's back to your point around the incentivization. How do you want organizations to do more, be it on the product side or the organizational side, but why? You know, it comes down to money, so put it in the procurement stuff, incentivize them, make it a mandatory requirement. That's a financial incentive for organizations to do stuff. But then you can place more of an onus on government. So at the moment, we've all talked about what industry can do. There's been no conversation around what government can do. And government can do a bit of like, not vendor favouring, but it's a question to government. What can you do to support and champion organisations that are doing the right things, that do have cyber essentials, that are adhering to certain things that are part of, you know, your initiatives or sharing and all the things that you've talked about. So how can you, not reward, but champion?
We are literally like little puppies. Like we will dance around and do tricks for a nice little pat on the head.
Yeah.
Really well.
I'm very glad we're recording all
Public pat
this.
on the head.
A public pat on the head. That's right. Yeah.
But then we have to balance that with the need to be impartial and figure it out. But I think it's a very valid question. It's like, how do we dance around that? And in a fair way,
if we're doing the right thing,
shine a light on the right
thing. And the people that aren't.
Maybe that's radical. And
if you build a whole framework around what the right thing is, you're basically back to compliance, if you see what I mean. Like, there's got to be a certain amount of dynamism to kind of how you spot the good behaviors and reward them.
I mean, there's kind of an example where, I mean, the companies that you trust the most are the ones, the companies that you trust the most whenever something goes really poorly or really wrong are the ones that before something bad happened, you had heard or read about them investing in certain areas or trying or innovating in this space, whatever space they're in. So basically, they're kind of pre-building that credit or that positive forethought or whatever. And then, something bad happens and you're like, well, we know they were trying. So you kind of like have to pre-build that matter of, trust before you actually have the issue. So
proactive transparency. That's a great place to draw us to a bit of a close, I think.
Proactive public transparency.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I would say, I mean, you can only do that if, like, you can only do good instant response if you've invested as a vendor in the vendors.
Very intentional.
The vendors that put up the walls in an incident, in my view, is because they've got something to hide, because they're scrabbling behind the scenes.
What about the ones that put the information behind a paywall, a supported paywall?
I mean, yeah, same, right? That's
that peeve, I had to get in.
Okay, I think this discussion could go on. The timer says that we're getting to the end of our time, and I'd like to thank you all for an excellent debate and a great discussion. I think there's plenty of stuff to go on here, and lots of things we can take on and continue to discuss. So, great many thanks for your time, and I'd be grateful if everyone could say a round of applause to thank the panel for their contribution.